Good afternoon. Every year, my high school put on an original show named after Saturday Night Live with skits written by alumni. My senior year, I played the matriarch in a skit called The Walkman Family. The Walkman was the precursor to the iPod. Same kind of headphones, but without the plethora of song options. Instead, you were limited to one cassette at a time that only contained one album. In this skit, each family member wore their Walkman continuously and filtered the world around them through the prism of the cassette they listened to. So, Father Walkman staggered along to the hazy hits of the 60s. Daughter Walkman punked out to the hits of the 80s, and I, as Mother Walkman, opened the scene belting out Midnight at the Oasis as I shuffled along to the hits of the 70s. The skit was filled with misunderstandings and misadventures, and the audience loved it. In recent years, I've thought a lot about the Walkman Family, but not with the light-hearted appreciation I had for it as a teenager. It's made me think a lot about our declaration of faith, the Shema, which is an imperative to listen. The Walkmans were so disconnected from one another, they were incapable of listening. It seems to me that the Walkman Family skit, silly and slapstick as it was, reflects a true problem in our society, a real crisis, an empathy crisis. As a society, we are really bad at practicing empathy. Much like the Walkman Family, we often interact without connecting and respond without hearing. I'm not alone in thinking we're in the midst of an empathy crisis. At the World Economic Forum in 2012, Arianna Huffington argued that the world wasn't suffering from a financial crisis or a Eurozone crisis as much as a crisis of empathy. And Brian Monch of the organization Common Dream outlines a long list of societal norms he points to as representing an empathy crisis. There is even a center dedicated to the building of a culture of empathy in response to the current crisis. Now, the word empathy can convey a wide range of meanings, but those who research elements of emotion define it as the ability to sense another's emotions, coupled with the ability to imagine what someone else might be thinking or feeling. According to UC Berkeley's Greater Good website, empathy can be broken down into two types. Perspective-taking empathy, that refers to our ability to identify and understand other people's beliefs or emotions. And affective empathy, that refers to the sensations and feelings we get in response to others' emotions. With perspective-taking, we demonstrate the ability to understand another's experience and viewpoint, even if we don't agree with them. Alternatively, affective empathy is when we are emotionally affected by the emotions of others. It is when we feel another's pain or stress or joy. Affective empathy is when we genuinely cry with those in pain and genuinely laugh with those in times of joy. Whether it's perspective-taking or affective, practicing empathy requires us to do three things: hear, see, and imagine. Hear, see, and imagine. For us to engage in empathetic behavior, we need to hear those around us. By that I mean, we need to listen attentively to what is said, both verbally and non-verbally. Listening requires us to take off our Walkmans, by turning off our phones and shutting down our electronics. Technology can benefit us in many ways, but it can also serve to disconnect us from others. Listening requires our attention and our presence. The second necessary variable for empathy involves seeing. we must see the humanity in others. And when we focus on externals, race or gender, socioeconomic status or orientation, or just different personality variables, we can miss the unique humanity held by every person. We can't engage in empathy if we don't see another's humanity. The third necessary variable for empathy is imagining. In order to feel another's pain or joy, we have to imagine what their experience feels like. Imagination is key to being an empathetic person. One need not experience a horrific trauma like a rape, or a supreme joy like the arrival of a grandchild, to understand the horror or joy associated with those events. But to do so does require imagination. But as a society, we often fail to hear, see, and imagine. You need only look at recent headlines to see our society's lack of empathy. When Joe Wilson, representative of South Carolina, screamed out, "You lie!" during the 2009 State of the Union address, he clearly wasn't interested in listening. When the Bush administration affirmed the opinion by its legal counsel that federal laws against torture, assault, and maiming would not apply to overseas interrogation of terror suspects, they ignored the humanity of the prisoners in their care. And when billionaire real estate investor Sam Zell complained that people shouldn't criticize the economic 1% because they work harder, he clearly didn't imagine what it would be to live without the advantages of wealth and have to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet. But we don't have to look to headlines to see examples of this empathy crisis. We can look within these hallowed halls to see examples of our own breakdown in hearing, seeing, and imagining. How often do we engage in discussions in which we are so consumed with expressing our own viewpoint that we don't really hear what's said by others? How often are we blind to or dismissive of the humanity of others by referring to them in objectifying terms like jerk, ass, or worse? And how often do we judge others by our own experience without imagining how their different experience could lead to feelings and choices different from our own? We all engage in these types of behaviors every day here at HUC. We do so in the society at large. And when we fail to listen, to see the other's humanity, and to imagine another's circumstances, we help contribute to our culture's empathy crisis. But what makes society's empathy crisis relevant for a group of current and future Jewish leaders? My answer is that cultivating empathy is a distinct and profound Jewish value, and it always has been. Listening is a central tenet in Judaism. The declaration of faith we say twice daily, the Shema, begins Shema Israel, hear or listen, Israel. JPS commentator Jeffrey Tide says that Shema in this verse instructs the Israelites to focus their attention, to listen up. And many of the 169 times the word Shema appears in the Tanakh are examples of God modeling empathy and compassion by listening and paying attention to those in need. And Pharaoh, the villain of our foundation story, demonstrates his callousness and lack of empathy again and again when he, lo shama, did not listen. Listening is central to Judaism, and so is seeing the humanity of others. In Genesis 1, we learned that God created the first humans, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. Our tradition takes this verse to mean that every human being is created in God's image and carries a spark of the divine. The importance humanity holds for our tradition is highlighted in Mishnah Sanhedrin, where we are told that whoever destroys one life is regarded by Torah as if they destroyed a whole world. And whoever saves one life is regarded as if they have saved a whole world. Our tradition also teaches, I believe, the importance of imagination. In Deuteronomy, Moses repeatedly tells the Israelites to remember that you were slaves in Egypt. The only problem is, the generation he was speaking to had never been slaves. Those who had been were dead by this point. When Moses says remember, what he seems to mean is imagine. Imagine what it was like to be slaves and act accordingly. And this imagining continues to be an integral part of our tradition. Next month, we celebrate Pesach. And at our Seder tables, we will recount our history and remember we were once slaves. We will imagine what it was like to be oppressed, and many of us will commit to fighting for those who actually are oppressed. While our ancient texts point to the importance of hearing, seeing, and imagining, our modern theologians make explicit empathy as a Jewish value. Buber's I Thou experience that allows us to glimpse divinity and be transformed is only possible when we engage with people empathetically. And Levinas's asymmetrical moral engagement, in which we are compelled to engage with those in pain, can only occur when we hear, see, and imagine the experience of the other. So, from the origin of our faith all the way down to modern times, empathy has been a key Jewish value, which makes our current empathy crisis a key concern for us as Jewish leaders. But what can we do? How can we impact a problem so pervasive? I believe there are two things we can do, and both have to do with our personal spheres of influence. Everyone in this room has a sphere of influence. We have friends, family, colleagues, teachers, and students who are influenced by our behavior, how we act, and what we say. As we go forward in our careers, our spheres of influence will grow. As rabbis, we will have significant power, and we are obligated to use that power wisely. Two ways in which we can wield that power to push against this empathy crisis are to model empathetic behavior ourselves and encourage empathetic behavior in others. We model empathy when we take off our Walkmans, when we turn off our phones, log out of Facebook, exit GChat, and listen to those around us. We model empathy when we indicate with our actions that the humanity of the professor lecturing, student presenting, or friend talking is more important than what might pop up on our computer screen. And we model empathy when we take time to imagine another's experience before judging their choices. Isaac Thiel modeled hearing, seeing, and imagining in a lovely way last year when he allowed a young black man he didn't know to sleep with his head on his shoulder through an entire subway ride. You might have seen the photo. When someone asked if they should wake the young man, Thiel responded, "He had a long day, so let him sleep." We've all been there. When we, as Jewish leaders, model empathy the way Mr. Thiel did, we provide an empathy roadmap for those we lead. Next, we need to encourage empathetic behavior in others. For instance, when a friend rants about Plony because they feel let down and angry, we can reframe the situation for them. I understand. Being let down is very upsetting. I know Plony has a lot on his plate right now. I think he just forgot. Or we can make explicitly clear that we are uncomfortable. For example, recently my congregants began talking about Christians in highly negative terms. But all I had to say was, we don't need to go down that path, and change the subject. My congregants registered my discomfort with the dehumanizing language, and were happy to follow me onto a more appropriate topic. It's not easy to model empathy for others, and it's not easy to encourage others to be empathetic. It takes awareness, commitment, and a willingness to risk being excluded from certain conversations or being perceived as holier than thou. But as Jewish leaders, we are obligated to reflect Jewish values and to attend to important issues. Empathy is a foundational Jewish value, and that makes the current empathy crisis worthy of our attention. Thank you.